Hello and finally welcome back to another Hollywood Wargaming Bolt Action Faction Review. It's been a while since we've done one of these and we covered most of the popular factions in Bolt Action already, but there is one other pretty popular faction that is rising up through the campaign books, and that is of course Hungary. And these guys got a lot of love during the Fortress Budapest campaign book that dropped last year. And it is very cool to see these guys get some love and representation, despite being a quote-unquote minor faction in World War II. And as far as a faction that comes pretty deep into an Allies of book, they are pretty well off, and without getting too far ahead of myself, I will say that they honestly give Finland and the Italians a run for their money. But of course, this review is going to be focusing on Hungary and their rules within the Italy and Armies of the Axis book. It is not taking into consideration any of the campaign books, though I may take a look at those down the road. And much like my previous video entries in this series, we are going to be ranking this faction on a 0 to 50 point scale, which can be pretty cruel and strict, but believe me when I say that when all armies are subjected to the same amount of criticism, they will be graded equally and on a curve. So don't be surprised if your favorite faction doesn't get a perfect score on these. And if you think I'm being unfair to one army, please go look at the other videos and realize that I am pretty harsh on giving out points to any of them. But this point system is broken down into 4 different categories. 2 major categories scoring 20 points each, and 2 minor categories scoring 5 points each, again equaling a total potential score of 50. And the first of those bigger categories is going to be the national characteristics, with each national characteristic equaling up to a total of 5 points. Meaning a primary nation like Germany or the US with 4 national characteristics will have a chance to score up to 20 points there. However, if you are a minor faction and you don't have 4 national characteristics, you will not be able to get the max amount of points there inevitably. And that's simply because less national characteristics means less bonuses to your army. However, as we've seen before and as we may see in this video, there are a few sneaky little tricks to get extra points in that category, such as unique weaponry, or extra platoon slots, or things like that, which aren't in the national characteristics, but they really are kind of a national characteristic. But after that, the next big category is going to be unit selection, and again, this is divided into 4 different categories, each valuing at 5 points. That's going to be your infantry, this is going to be your HQ, your foot soldiers, all the basic things that make up your core army. Infantry support, this is going to be your machine gun teams, special weapons, artillery, things of that sort. Support vehicles, this will be armored cars, trucks, anti-aircraft guns, and then lastly, armor itself, which is going to be tanks, SPGs, assault guns, and all other big heavy things that go bang. And after unit selection, we are going to have the first of our minor categories, which again can only score 0 to 5 points each. And the first of these 2 is going to be flavor. How does the army feel when you play it? Does it feel like it has a unique identity? And is there a fun factor that makes them stand out from other armies when you are either playing them or collecting them? And lastly here we are going to have balance, which is a big one. And this is going to determine how well they fit into that bolt action meta, and how well they will operate on the tabletop. But the interesting thing about balance here is that you will not only get docked points for being a piss-poor army that is no fun to play, you will also get docked points if you are an overpowered army, if you're an army that is not fun to play against. So a perfectly balanced faction here, that has its strengths and has its weaknesses, and fits in with the rules of bolt action nicely, is going to score a 5. Meanwhile, an overpowered and cheesy faction is going to lose you some points. But more commonly with the armies of books, you're going to see a lot more of these nations losing points because they just can't compete with a lot of the top dogs here. But let's go ahead and jump in and see how Hungary stands up to these other nations. And first up, we are going to have the national characteristics. And I have to say, the first one up here is probably the entire spinal cord and nervous system and muscle structure and skeleton and skin and everything else for the Hungarian army. And that is the Axis Support national characteristic. And this is going to allow you to take 1 unit of your choice from the Armies of Germany book or the Italian Eastern Front Theater selector in this Italy and Armies of the Axis book. And here's the real kicker here. That unit is not going to count towards your platoon structure. And yes, you can take vehicles. On the contrary, that unit cannot be a veteran unit, and it cannot have a damage value or armor value of 10 or 11, with the exception of the Tiger 1. So this rule is going to allow you to take any vehicle of your choice up to an armor value of 9, that of a medium tank, or the Tiger 1, and include it in your reinforced platoon without taking up the armored slot. So right off the bat, this is just an awesome national characteristic, maybe the best one in the game, because it allows you to skirt that very tight, narrow, and restrictive platoon structure. And that is huge, especially when you are playing competitive or tournaments, which usually limit you to just one reinforced platoon. And while the Tiger may have lost a lot of its luster over the years, even doubling down on things like armored cars, medium tanks, or artillery pieces, or anti-tank guns is a very, very huge bonus that not a lot of other factions get to enjoy like this. It creates a ton of liberty, and I think almost everyone can agree when I say that this is the biggest draw to collecting Hungarian, especially if you already have a German collection and all those vehicles to throw about. So as a national characteristic on a scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to go ahead and rank this a 7. Yeah, I'm going to cheese the rules a bit here, because this really is more than one national characteristic combined. Remember when I said earlier that sometimes you have extra platoon slots in your faction, like the extra anti-tank teams in the Soviets, and how those are a sort of unsung national characteristic on their own? The same is the case here. This is a rule that doesn't just let you take units from the Armies of Germany book. It is one that basically gives you an extra platoon slot of your choice throughout your entire faction. So it really is 2 rules blended into one. The first being able to use vehicles from another faction, sort of like the British with the Lend-Lease, and the second, again, adding that extra reinforced platoon slot onto any category in your faction that you wish. Just an absolutely fantastic national characteristic, and honestly, I would argue probably the best one in the game. If you agree or disagree with that, please leave a comment below and put up any other competitors. And that will bring us along to our next national characteristic, which is going to be Experienced Officer Corps. And this characteristic is going to grant all of your HQ units in the Hungarian faction the Fanatics keyword. And while Fanatics is a fantastic keyword to have on almost every unit in the game, I think the unit that benefits from it the least is going to be your headquarters units. These guys just aren't meant for combat, especially melee combat, which is where Fanatics really shines. And the other great perk that's granted by Fanatics, not having to take a morale test until you're down to your last man, is also kind of rendered somewhat useless when you consider that your HQ squad sizes cap out at just 3 men. So that whole morale test at half strength versus morale at your last man is going to kick in when you get down to just your officer, be it a 3 or 2 man unit. It doesn't really give you any actual bonus here. So while I absolutely love Fanatics as a keyword, the Experienced Officer Corps national characteristic is only going to net them 1 out of 5 points. I just think it's a very minor bonus that's not going to come in handy very often. And unfortunately for Hungary, that is the only 2 national characteristics you're going to be getting here. But hey, at least one of them is arguably the best national characteristic in the game. However, Hungary does have an extra trick up its sleeve in this category, as they do have access to equipping Panzerfausts, and in pretty good numbers. And much like the other factions, these unique weapons are going to net them an extra bonus point. They are very fantastic pieces of equipment that not everyone has access to. So, despite the miserable rating for the Experienced Officer Corps, it is saved by the bonus Panzerfaust points and the whopping 7 points that I gave the Axis Support characteristic. And that brings them up to a relatively respectable 9 out of 20 points. And I say relatively because if you thumb through these armies of books, you're going to see a lot more lackluster traits in that national characteristic category. And sometimes nations even get negative drawbacks as national characteristics, such as communications breakdown. So a score of 9 is pretty respectable in that regard. However, that will move us along to our unit selection category, which again is a major category of 20 points divided into 4 sections, starting off with infantry. And with this category, you are going to be getting an extremely rudimentary amount of variety here. You have a standard headquarters, medic, and you can get a artillery officer. No air observer, but that's fine because we all hate that guy anyways. But for your core troop options, you're basically going to be getting just a inexperienced, a regular, and a veteran squad, all of which are pretty much just equipped with the standard denomination of NCO with a submachine gun, followed up by another potential SMG guy, 1 optional LMG upgrade, and the rest is more or less just all riflemen. And normally I would really scoff at this amount of selection. It's not a whole lot, but it's worth noting that we can stack these squads up to a total of 13 men. And as we know, in bolt action, larger squads do tend to perform a bit better. On top of that, we can also equip them with Panzerfausts. though only the regular experienced squad can take them, and they can only take one. And as you guys know, if you refer back to my Panzerfaust for Shrek video, Fausts really benefit from being taken in large numbers in single units. Still, one Faust is better than none, and it does grant the entire squad the Tank Hunter keyword, which is pretty unique. After all that, the only other option we are going to be getting for Hungary here is going to be the Cavalry section. And these are more or less just a highly mobile veteran infantry squad that is only armed with rifles. And I'm scared to bash this unit a bit because I'm pretty sure a lot of people getting into Hungary are kind of doing so because they want some cavalry units. While the Axis Support national characteristic seems to be the major draw to this faction in terms of meta, I think the Cavalry draws in a lot of the collectors. And that's definitely respectable. But I do feel like that high mobility offered by those horseback riders is kind of nullified by the fact that they're only going to be a relatively small squad, armed only with rifles, and I think they might just be a little overpriced for what they are. So I gotta say, your infantry selection here is pretty rudimentary, but it has almost everything you need. You have your veteran infantry, you have your regular infantry, you have large squads, and you have access to LMGs and SMGs. And those really are the core building blocks to any bolt action list right there. But what really saves this faction from just getting snowballed in this category is the fact that you get large squads, access to Panzerfaust, and also their access to cavalry. So the Hungarians are going to be getting a very middling 3 out of 5 for infantry. But let's move along and take a look at infantry support. And in this category, things are pretty run-of-the-mill, which is actually a good sign for a minor faction. You get your machine guns, your mortars, anti-tank rifles. You also get Panzerschreck teams, which is nice to have those rockets, especially in a minor faction, which are usually very lacking in anti-tank options, especially ones that do not need tows to get around the battlefield. So Panzerschreck, very big bonus here. But you're also going to have your snipers, no heavy mortar, but you get the other two. You're going to have access to light, medium, and heavy anti-tank guns and artillery. And on top of all of that, you're going to have the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft cannon. And it's usually always a good sign if this category does include an autocannon of some sort. However, it's definitely not a full arsenal. You're missing a few things here and there, most notably a flamethrower. Flamethrowers are still incredibly overpowered in bolt action, and there is not one in this army. Because of that, the Hungarians are going to be getting a 4 out of 5 in the infantry support category. And with that category wrapped up, we are going to be moving along to take a look at our support vehicles. And this is where Hungarians really start to get their own identity and kind of get interesting in my opinion. A lot of their vehicles do feel like that interwar period, where those old European empires started to kind of wane in their glory, and fell by the way as superpowers as the horizons of their world expanded, and things like industry and oil really became major focal points and determined who was going to be the main players in the game after the First World War. So when I look at vehicles like the Toldi and the Xaba, I get this really warm and fuzzy, almost steampunk kind of feel of these vehicles that were cutting edge in 1932 to 1935, but then were more or less obsolete by the time 1943 rolled around. But as far as the rules and bolt action go, we see a lot of that fun interwar period stuff, like vehicles with anti-tank rifles in the turrets. And you can get some pretty fun and hilariously cost-efficient vehicles that can actually do a decent job puffing up your activation pool, and also skirting around and being a nuisance on the battlefield. So while your selections between armored cars and transports are incredibly limited with the Hungarians, they can serve decently as mobile pillboxes. And the Xaba 39M itself can also be upgraded with a command vehicle trait, which is pretty useful, especially when you consider that it has recce and dual direction steering. And because of that, I think you will be including one of these two tankettes or armored cars in your list when you do play Hungarian, as they're very inexpensive, they're quick, and they'll give you a little bit of list diversity and challenges to harass your enemies. Still, with such a paltry and fragile selection, I am going to have to give the support vehicles category a 2 out of 5 score for the Hungarians. After that, we are going to have the Hungarian Armor. And things are actually pretty respectable in this category. Again, we're not going to get a lot of variety, and you definitely get a lot of that cutting edge in 1938 vibes going on here. But in the rules of bolt action, a lot of these vehicles, when you consider their upgrades, really fit the bill of what an army needs. You can go light and get that CV-35 tankette with 2 turret-mounted MMGs. You can upgrade your Turan to a Turan II, which is more or less just a Panzer IIIL. And your Zrinyi assault gun is more or less like the Stu-42, which is a very popular platform for that medium howitzer. You also get the Nimrod anti-aircraft tank, which is just a very awesome vehicle with a heavy-mounted autocannon, and sits at just 90 points to take. It's a very good chassis for that, and a very cool vehicle in its own right. So while your selection here is very thin, the options you do have kind of cover all of the corners that you want from a lot of your vehicles. Keep in mind that vehicles in bolt action are a bit of a sandpit when you're list building, and having your 4 options be a tankette mobile pillbox, a autocannon platform, a howitzer platform, and a raw medium tank will prevent you from falling into the trap of saying, I don't know, maybe buying a Tiger 1. Just kidding, but in all seriousness, the Hungarians are going to be getting a 3 out of 5 in this category of armor. They just barely eke it out above a 2, and if one of these vehicles was slightly more lackluster, I'm not sure if they would be getting it. So with infantry scoring a 3 points, infantry support scoring 4 points, support vehicles scoring a meager 2 points, and armor scoring 3 points, that is going to bring our unit selection up to a total of just 12 points. However, once again, we do have something else to consider. We have that national characteristic, and that is going to bring in a whole slew of options for vehicles here, and that will not only allow you to expand your collection with a ton of different armored vehicles that are iconic to the Second World War, but also give you a ton of flexibility in list building. And rather than taking those considerations into each of those categories I previously mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and just throw on an additional 3 points for German options into the unit selection rating. And that will bring the Hungarian unit selection from 12 points up to a very respectable 15 points. And once again, that national characteristic of Axis support is really bearing down on this entire faction's identity. So let's go ahead and talk about identity. We're going to move along to the flavor category, the first of our 2 minor categories, which can net up to 5 points for the Hungarians. And first up here, I'm going to reflect back on the Cavalry. I mentioned them, they're very popular, they're very unique, and they are very much a stoic symbol of these sort of southeastern European nations, who again were still kind of fighting the last war. And that again is going to tie in with their tanks and armored cars that I was talking about. Again, they feel very cutting edge for the interwar period, and you can really just tell which nations didn't put as much emphasis on arms production after the First World War. And that may not be a good thing for these nations in real life history, but for flavor and bolt action, it's pretty great. It really does give them a unique identity, especially when you consider collecting them. However, there are some very limited options when it comes to list building, especially when you look at the infantry. You're just not getting a whole lot of flexibility there, and a lot of your lists are going to be looking pretty similar the more you play. And on top of all of that, we are going to have the fact that you can take German units. And this is going to be the one part of the video where that actually becomes a drawback. It is a major selling point to Hungarian players, and perhaps the focal point of the faction, and I think that really does degrade their uniqueness, at least when it comes to collecting and playing against them. I mean, imagine being an allied player at a club where everyone you play against is German, and then a new guy shows up and says, "Oh, I don't play German," and you say, "Oh, thank God," and he says, "I play Hungarian," and then he whips out his Tiger. Again, I do love that national characteristic overall, but I think it does kind of wither away when it comes to the flavor category, and the Hungarians are just going to score a 3 out of 5 here. They definitely have enough going for them that makes them unique, but there's definitely a lack of unit variety, especially in the infantry category, and the fact that their best vehicles are going to be German vehicles most of the time almost makes them feel like an extension to the Armies of Germany book. But lastly, we are going to have the balance category, again a minor category ranking up to 5 points. And here, the Hungarians are going to be scoring a 4 out of 5. I think they're just relatively balanced. The only thing that I think makes them somewhat unbalanced is the ability, again, to take another faction's vehicles and put them in a free slot outside of your reinforced platoon structure. That's just extremely good, and I wish more factions could do that one way or another, because most tournaments don't let you run armored platoons, and that's just a huge way to get around that barrier. But aside from that, I think they are an incredibly balanced faction. I think they can compete wholeheartedly, they won't get swept off the battlefield, and I don't think playing them is going to be a nightmare either, especially now that Tiger Fear's gone. So let's go ahead and tally up the whole roster and see what the Hungarians score. So again, we're going to have a 9 out of 20 in national characteristics, floated by that Axis support and bonus by the Panzerfaust. We're going to have unit selection coming in at 15 points. Pretty middling results through and through, but saved by that German options that you can take there, which scored them some extra points. And after that, we have the minor categories, the first being flavor, with just 3 out of 5 points. Again, it's hard to have a lot of flavor when you don't have a whole lot of units to choose from, and the fact that some of your best units are just going to be German vehicles is going to degrade that a bit also, but still respectable. And again, lastly, we have balance that we just went over, scoring 4 out of 5, which brings us to a total of 31 points. And overall, I gotta say, that is pretty damn good for such a quote-unquote minor faction that comes up very, very late in the Armies of Axis book. But I want to know what you guys think about the Hungarians in Bolt Action. Do you think they're a very underrated faction? What do you think about them versus the Finns? Do you think they're better than the Finns? It's kind of iffy here. I feel like they have more armor and the Finns have better infantry. I honestly think both of them might be better than the Italians, though. Let me know what you guys think below. As always, leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more content like this, turning on notifications, and until next time, guys, take care.